Most people think of Vietnam as a jungle. They think of the triple canopy green, the red dust of the highlands, or the mud of the Mekong Delta. But for me, Vietnam was grey. It was the endless, shifting grey of the Tonkin Gulf. It was a place that didn't exist on any map, yet it was the only place that mattered. We called it Yankee Station. Now, if you look at a map of the world, you won't find a city called Yankee Station. You won't even find a rock sticking out of the water. It was an imaginary point, a coordinate in the sea, sort of in the middle of the Tonkin Gulf. But practically, it was a meat grinder for the clock. It was where the US Navy sat, straddling the DMZ, close enough to the coast to see the white foam of the surf line and the sea snakes writhing in the water, yet far enough out that the horizon looked exactly like the middle of the Pacific. I was aboard the USS Misspillion. We weren't a destroyer, we weren't a carrier, we were a jumboized oiler. Basically, a 700-foot floating gas station. And in the 1960s, a gas station in a war zone is a very busy place to be. Our life was a pendulum. At one end was Subic Bay in the Philippines. That was home port. We'd hit Subic every couple of weeks. Sometimes we'd get a week-long stretch to breathe, to feel solid ground under our feet, to pretend the world wasn't on fire. Other times it was a one-day consolidation turnaround. But the worst were the 24-hour hits at the fuel pier. No liberty, no leaving the ship. You just sat there, the smell of heavy oil thick in your lungs, watching the fuel lines pump until the tanks were full. Then the engines would roar, the lines would be cast off, and we'd head right back to the line, back to the grey. Being on station was a strange kind of purgatory. We spent our lives cruising up and down the coast in large, mind-numbing ovals, day after day, week after week. For a long time, I actually had no idea where I was. You don't get a GPS in 1970. You get a horizon and a compass. It wasn't until later, when I started plotting my positions, that I realized just how much of that coastline I'd seen. I'd been everywhere from just south of Haiphong, down past the Cambodian border, all the way up to Thailand. And then, there was the night we ended up somewhere we definitely weren't supposed to be. I was in the hole, down in the engine room, working my shift. It was a quiet evening, or so I thought. Above me on the bridge an officer walked in, glanced at the navigational chart, and turned pale. I wasn't there to see his face, but I heard the story later. He looked at the coordinates, looked at the dark mass of land on the horizon, and shouted, "We're where?" We had drifted toward Hainan, communist Chinese territory. A navigational error that could have sparked an international incident, or gotten us blown out of the water before we knew what hit us. Down in the hole, I didn't see the 180-degree turn, but I felt it. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the telegraph bells started screaming. Clang, 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 all ahead full. The Misspillion groaned as she strained to find every bit of horsepower she had. We held that speed for a long time, running away from a shore we weren't supposed to see, heading back into the safety of the open grey. That was life on the Misspillion. Boredom, followed by brief moments of, "Oh God," followed by the work. And the work was the Unrep. The routine of the Tonkin Gulf was built around 5 letters. Unrep, underway replenishment. To the guys on the carriers, we were just the gas station, but to us, it was a high-stakes mechanical dance performed at 15 knots in the middle of the ocean. Imagine 2 massive steel buildings, one a tanker, one a destroyer or a carrier, sailing side by side, less than 100 feet apart. At that distance, the physics of the ocean start to get weird. The pressure between the 2 hulls wants to suck you together or push you apart. You aren't just sailing, You're fighting the sea to stay in a straight line. The process always started the same way. A ship needing fuel would approach us from astern, creeping up on our port side. We'd maintain a steady course and speed, and they'd have to maintain station on us. It looks graceful from a distance, but up close, it's a symphony of screaming winches and diesel exhaust. First, the gunner's mate would step out. He'd shoulder a line-throwing gun and fire a shot across the gap. That tiny little messenger line was the first handshake. Once the other crew grabbed it, they'd start pulling. That line would bring over a larger line, and that larger line would eventually haul a massive steel cable across the churning water. That cable is the backbone of the whole operation. It's attached to the receiving ship and then tensioned from our side, the Misspillion. Once it's tight, it works like a high-tech shower curtain rod. We'd slide the refueling probe and the heavy rubber hoses across that wire. My job was right in the thick of it. I was the Station 6 phone talker. During every Unrep, I had to don a set of sound-powered telephones, the kind that don't need batteries, just the vibration of your voice turning into a signal. I'd stand there on the deck, looking across less than 100 feet of white-capped water at my counterpart on the other ship. There's a specific kind of tension in an Unrep that you don't find anywhere else. You're surrounded by stored energy. You've got steel cables under thousands of pounds of tension, cables that, if they snapped, would whip across the deck and cut a human being in half like a piece of soft butter. You've got high-pressure air lines hissing and manila lines thick as a man's wrist humming with the strain. Nothing bad ever happened while I was on duty at Station 6, but the danger was always there, vibrating in the deck plating under your boots. It was a constant reminder that the ocean doesn't care about the war. It just wants to sink whatever is floating on it. Once the probe was seated and the connections were locked, the command to commence pumping would come through my headset. I'd relay it to the other ship, and the fuel would start moving, thousands of gallons of black blood flowing from our heart into theirs. And then we waited. Once the pumping starts, the frantic activity dies down. You're just two ships tied together by a hose, moving through the waves. That's when the war became human. Because I had those phones on, I had to talk to the guy on the other side. We weren't talking about tactics or the DMZ. We talked about where we were from. Hey, I'm from Ohio. No kidding? I'm from Pennsylvania. We'd talk about the food, the heat, or what we were going to do when we finally got back to the States. It was a strange, intimate moment of connection in the middle of a conflict. But it was during one of those quiet moments, standing there with the wind whipping my hair and the heavy smell of JP5 jet fuel in my nose, that the reality of what I was doing finally hit me. And it hit me hard. There's a specific kind of cognitive dissonance that happens when you're 20 years old and trying to find your place in a world that's screaming at itself. Before I ever set foot on the Misspillion, I was already conflicted. Back home, I'd been caught up in the anti-war movement. I'd seen the protests, heard the music, and read the papers. In fact, I'd even tried to get out of the military as a conscientious objector. I didn't want any part of the killing. I didn't want to be a cog in a machine that I fundamentally didn't believe in. But the Navy has a way of making you feel like your individual conscience is a very small thing compared to the size of a 700-foot ship. By the time I was standing at Station 6, I had managed to compartmentalize it. I told myself I was just a sailor. I was just a gas station attendant. I wasn't carrying a rifle. I was carrying a phone. I wasn't dropping bombs. I was just pumping oil. Then came the day we pulled alongside an aircraft carrier. When you're on an oiler, a destroyer looks small. A cruiser looks manageable. But an aircraft carrier is a floating city. It's a mountain of steel that blocks out the sun. As we made our approach and the lines went over, The sheer scale of the thing started to press down on me. The Unrep started like any other. The cables were tensioned, the hoses were sent across, and I was on the phones checking the levels with my counterpart on the carrier's deck. But this time, the carrier wasn't just cruising. They were conducting flight ops. I stood there, my boots vibrating from the rush of the fuel moving through the hoses beneath me. Thousands of gallons of black fuel oil and highly volatile JP5 jet fuel. I looked up, and right there, maybe 80 feet away, I saw them. F-4 Phantoms. They were lined up on the flight deck, their engines screaming, the heat haze shimmering off their tails. And hanging from their bellies, like heavy Ugg fruit, were 500-pound bombs. Everything I had told myself to stay sane, all the excuses about being just a support role, collapsed in an instant. I realized that the fuel I was pumping at that very second wasn't just cargo. It was the lifeblood of those jets. Without the oil from my ship, those Phantoms would be nothing but expensive paperweights sitting on a deck. Because of the work I was doing, those planes were going to lift off, fly over the horizon toward the coast of Vietnam, and drop those 500-pounders on people I would never meet. I wasn't neutral. I wasn't a bystander. I was an active participant in the destruction. I was the one pulling the trigger. I was just doing it from 100 feet away through a rubber hose. I looked at the carrier, watching the steam rise from the catapults. An F-4 roared off the deck, banking hard toward the land. I felt a wave of self-loathing wash over me that I wasn't prepared for. I didn't like myself very much right then. I felt like a coward. I felt like a sellout. I had tried to claim I was a conscientious objector, but here I was, literally fueling the very thing I claimed to despise. It was a moment of brutal clarity. That moment may have been the turning point where I started re-evaluating everything: who I was, what I was doing, and what part I was actually willing to play in this war. I don't think I was fully aware of the shift while it was happening. I just knew that the imaginary point in the Tonkin Gulf wasn't the only thing that was shifting. My entire internal compass was spinning, and for the first time, I realized I couldn't just get by anymore. I had to figure out who I was going to be when the pumping stopped. After that moment of clarity with the carrier, you'd think the world would change. But the Navy doesn't stop for an existential crisis. The war kept moving, and so did we. The routine of underway replenishment was repeated endlessly, day after day, at any hour of the day or night. Time on the line doesn't work like time on land. It loses its edges. On a ship at sea, you don't have Mondays or Fridays. You have on watch and off watch. You have the next unrep and the last one. Pretty soon, you forget what day of the week it is. You forget what month it is. The sun rises out of the water. It burns in the center of the sky until your skin feels like parchment, and then it sinks back into the waves. You learn to get by on 4 hours of sleep, snatched in a hot, cramped bunk while the ship groans around you. You become a ghost in a machine made of steel and oil. It was tedious. It was mind-numbingly boring for 90% of the time. But it's a strange thing about being out there. It's in that space between the boredom and the exhaustion where you see things you would never, ever experience in the safety and complacency of America. Take a night unrep, for example. In the middle of the Tonkin Gulf, when the moon is down, the darkness is absolute. It's a physical weight. Then, suddenly, the deck lights of a massive destroyer flicker on, illuminating the white spray of the ocean between you. You see the phosphorescence in the wake, tiny glowing organisms churned up by the props, lighting up the water like a liquid galaxy. You're standing there, hooked up to a set of sound-powered phones, talking to a guy whose face you can't see, while the air smells like ozone and salt and heavy diesel. It felt like being on another planet. And then there were the sea snakes. On the days we drifted closer to the shore, the water would change color, turning from that deep, bottomless blue to a murky, silted green. Thousands of them, yellow and black, undulating in the waves. You'd look down from the rail and realize the ocean was alive in ways they never told you about in school. Back in America, people were arguing about the war on television. They were sitting in air-conditioned living rooms, eating dinner, watching 3 minutes of evening news before turning the channel. For them, Vietnam was a set of statistics or a political debate. But for us, the safety of America felt like a dream we'd had a lifetime ago. Out here, the war wasn't a debate. It was the physical weight of a steel cable. It was the way the ship shivered when an aircraft carrier hit the gas. It was the reality of being on the line, where your world was reduced to a 700-foot deck and the person on the other end of the phone. I started to realize that the complacency I left behind was a luxury I didn't have anymore. In the States, you could ignore the machinery of the world. You could flip a switch and the light came on, never thinking about the power plant. You could fill your car with gas and never think about where it came from. But on the Misspillion, I was the guy at the switch. I was the guy at the pump. There was no more looking away. The tedium was actually a constant low-level confrontation with reality. Every time I donned those phones, every time I watched a ship peel away after taking its fill, I was reminded that there is no such thing as being uninvolved. We were all part of it, whether we wanted to be or not. The only difference was that out here, in the middle of a coordinate that didn't exist, you had to look it in the eye every single day. If there is one image that sums up the surreal absurdity of my war, it isn't a weapon or a flag. It's a giant orange and blue plastic sphere. The Union 76 ball. You've seen them at gas stations across America, spinning slowly on top of a pole. Well, the USS Misspillion had one too. We had it mounted right there on the rig. To the rest of the fleet, it was a joke, a bit of naval humor. We were the gas station, so we might as well look the part. But as I look back on it now, that ball was a tether. It was a piece of the world we had left behind, perched precariously over a deck covered in grey paint and military hardware. It was a reminder that even in the Tonkin Gulf, we were still an extension of the suburban streets and the highway exits of home. Eventually, our time on the line would come to an end. The Misspillion would turn its bow away from the coast, leaving the imaginary coordinates of Yankee Station behind. We'd head back across the Pacific, through the long swells, until the silhouette of the California coastline replaced the hazy mountains of Vietnam. Stepping back onto American soil was like walking into a movie that had been playing without you. People were still arguing. The protests were still happening. The safety and complacency I'd thought about in the middle of the night was still there, but I couldn't seem to fit back into it. Once you've stood on a deck and watched the black blood of the war move through a hose, you don't see the world the same way. You don't see a jet in the sky without thinking about the fuel. You don't see a political headline without thinking about the 19-year-old kid holding the sound-powered phones on the other end of the line. I never did get out as a conscientious objector. The bureaucracy of the military is a lot harder to navigate than the Tonkin Gulf. But in a way, I'm glad I stayed. If I hadn't been there, I wouldn't have understood the most important lesson the war had to teach, that support is not a passive word. Everything we do connects to something else. The fuel I pumped became the fire over the north, and the silence of the American public became the permission for the war to keep spinning in those large, endless ovals. The USS Misspillion is gone now. Scrapped. The steel that I walked on, the cables I watched with bated breath, the Station 6 phones. They've all been melted down or lost to time. Yankee Station is just a set of numbers again, a patch of water indistinguishable from the rest of the Pacific. But sometimes, when I'm driving down a highway at night and I see the glow of a gas station sign in the distance, I'm right back there. I can feel the vibration of the deck under my boots. I can smell the JP5. I can hear the voice of a kid from Pennsylvania in my ear, asking me what I'm going to do when I get home. We weren't the heroes on the evening news. We weren't the ones in the jungle. We were just the men in the middle, keeping the machine running. We were the gas station at the end of the world. And for a few years of my life, that imaginary point in the sea was the most real place on Earth.